once again, and welcome back to Channel 514 and SPK Plus. And what we're going to be doing tonight is continuing our series Exploring Ancient Literature, and we will be continuing the part of that series in which we discuss Egyptian literature. And tonight, the area of Egyptian literature that I wanted to discuss is the classic texts of the Middle Kingdom. So what we call the Middle Kingdom in Egyptian history spans from 2055, I have it written down here, 2055 to 1650 BC. So this period comes after, in case you don't remember, it comes after the Old Kingdom and what is called the First Intermediate Period. So it's not hard to guess why they have these names. The Old Kingdom is the earliest long period in which Egypt is under a united monarchy, and that's followed by a First Intermediate Period, which is a less orderly period, and which is itself followed by the Middle Kingdom, which is another long-lasting united monarchy. And after that, of course, you have another intermediate period, the second of these, then the New Kingdom, and then a third intermediate period, and then what is known as the Late Period, and so on and so on. But in any case, some of the greatest or the most significant Egyptian literature comes from the Middle Kingdom, and this is sometimes spoken of as a Middle Kingdom Renaissance. So in this period, we get some of the great literary achievements of ancient Egypt. Outside of the kind of thing that we talked about earlier, like the pyramid texts and the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead and the mythological texts about Osiris and the gods and etc., etc. So these stories that we're going to be talking about are not really of a religious or mythological character. They're about really a variety of things, but they're more literary, you could say. So the first of these is known as, let's see what it's called in the book we're going to be using. Our source, as usual here, is the Literature of Ancient Egypt. That's Yale University Press 2003. The editor is a William Kelly Simpson, who is associated with Yale University, and then there are 4 different translators whose translations are included in the volume. So there's a section here called Middle Egyptian Narrative Tales. That's early in the book, and that's what our material tonight is going to be taken from. So the first of these, the translator, which is William Kelly Simpson himself in this one, he calls it King Cheops and the Magicians. Now, I first encountered this story a long, long time ago as King Khufu and the Magicians, because if you're not aware, Cheops and Khufu are names used for the pharaoh of the 4th dynasty who was buried in the Great Pyramid. So, in a sense, he himself is an emblem or an icon of the Old Kingdom and its glory, because under his reign, pyramid building reached its height, and that's why we call his pyramid the Great Pyramid. And so, after his time, this art, this practice, was, one could say, in decline, or it dropped off, sometime after his time, and never attained to the scale we think of when we think of the great pyramids of the Giza Plateau. And so, in later times, people looked back on the glories of the Old Kingdom as an innocent, happy time when Egypt was at its best and at its most prosperous, and had an optimistic sense that it would always be this way, and that the kingdom was going to go from glory to glory and be attaining better and better things all the time, and that the kings were these godlike beings who were destined to rise up to the imperishable stars, as it said in the pyramid texts, which we studied a few videos back. But this text that we're going to be reading is probably from the 12th dynasty, although the papyrus itself, that is our source, belongs to the period shortly before the 18th dynasty, when a part of Egypt, at least, was under the rule of this group called the Hyksos. But in any case, the author, living in the Middle Kingdom, is looking back on these fabulous glory days of the Old Kingdom. So it's sort of the Camelot of King Khufu's court, or the court of King Cheops, whichever name you choose to use. But in this story, the characters at the very center of it are magicians, and what they do is they amaze the king and his court with great feats of magic. And so we can presume at the very beginning of the story, because our papyrus is damaged or incomplete, and so our story picks up sort of in the middle, but we can guess that at the beginning of the story, Khufu, the great king, he is bored or he is feeling low, and so he gathers about him some of his sons who were themselves well known in later times, whose names were well known. And so he gathers them together and he wants them to relieve his boredom. So he wants them to regale him with tales of amazing things. And so that sort of sets up our story, because now we know we're going to hear about great magicians who did these amazing things in the past. And so the first of his sons, he tells him about a magician who lived in the 3rd dynasty under King Nebka, and this magician's name is given as Weba Oner, and he's described as the chief lector. I believe that at least 2 of these magicians in our stories are described as the chief lector. Or actually, I should back up a little, because the very first story that's told is cut off in our papyrus, so we only really see how it ends, or how the king is pleased with it when his son has concluded the story. And so he commands, as he does at the end of each of these stories, that some offerings, a haunch of beef, it says, and a certain amount of beer, etc., that all these things be dedicated to the shade or to the departed soul of the magician whose story has just been told. And so the second son, and that's Khafre, or Khafre, who is the son of Khufu, whose pyramid is near his, and whose pyramid is associated with the statue that we call the Sphinx. So Khafre is going to tell the story about the 3rd dynasty king Nebka and his chief lector Weba Oner. And what happens in that story is that the magician, the chief lector, he finds out that his wife is being unfaithful to him with a townsman, as it's rendered here in the translation, with a townsman. And so he's incensed at this, and so he makes a crocodile. He fashions a little magical fetish or something of a crocodile, and of course he brings it to life, and the crocodile eats the young lover. And so, and something happens to his wife too. I forget it really, even if it's put very clearly in here, but he brings his enemies or his tormentors, to a terrible end. And so the next story here is told by, who is it told by? Khafre is the name of the son of the king who's telling this story. And so he tells a story about King Snefru. I don't have a footnote here giving his regnal dates, but he's another Old Kingdom pharaoh, you can guess, from either the 3rd or the 4th dynasty. And so in this one, The king, just like Khufu himself in the frame story, he is bored or feeling low, and so he is looking for some way, some interesting diversion. And so one of his associates, it may be the magician of the story himself, but one of his associates in any case tells him that he should take a cruise on his royal barge down the Nile or up the Nile. And so the rowers of the barge are these scantily clad women, and so the king is pleased with this. But suddenly they come to a halt because one of the rowers has lost a turquoise pendant in the river, and so, and it's in the shape of a fish, and so she's just feeling too bad about this to keep rowing, I guess, and so, or maybe she just wants to take a break, but the magician parts the water and they're able to get the pendant back. And so that's the great magical feat in the story. And so after that, that would be the third of the tales. We have A Marvel in the Time of King Khufu himself, as it's subtitled here, the fourth tale, A Marvel in the Time of King Khufu himself. And so the son who speaks here is the most illustrious in a certain way of the sons of Khufu, Hardadef, and you may remember him being mentioned in the Song of the Harper in our first study in our 10-part series, Quality of Life and the Harper, where our poet sings, I have heard the words of Imhotep and Hardadef, whose maxims are repeated intact as proverbs, but what of their places? So, even in the Harper's time, in the New Kingdom, the name of this son of Khufu, Hardadef, had become associated with a wisdom text or with a tradition of wisdom texts, proverbs, maxims associated with this son of the king. And he's even on a level with the great Imhotep, the great polymath and architect who built the the step pyramid at Saqqara, etc. So Hardadef doesn't just tell a story about a magician who lived in the past. He tells the king that there is a magician living in his own realm named Dedi or Jedi. I've seen it put both ways. And that this person knows some secrets that the king wants to know. Something to do with the secret chambers in a certain temple, and that he has fantastic abilities. So, for example, he eats a prodigious amount of bread and drinks a prodigious amount of beer every day, more than a man could really do. So this man has fantastic abilities anyway. So the king wants to meet this guy, so he has him summoned to the court, and this magician performs a series of great feats. For example, he says that he can reattach the severed head of a person or an animal, and the king wants to try this out on a prisoner, some poor hapless person, and the magician is too compassionate to allow this. I believe that's how it goes. And so he insists that it be a goose or a fowl of some kind instead. And so, of course, he's able to do that. He's able to reattach the severed head after it's been lopped off. And so then at one point he tames a lion, they release a lion, and the magician is able to just command it to lie down and be tame. So finally, the king wants to know about the secret chambers in the temple because there's some kind of knowledge there, there's some kind of information there that he wants to have. And the magician says that he doesn't know it, but he knows that someone is about to be born or has recently been born who will eventually tell the king about it. And possibly it would make sense that the information has something to do with a way that the king could build his pyramid or make it greater than it otherwise be. But anyway, the problem, though, is that the person who's going to be born, who's going to have this information, is one of the sons of Rededet. So he's actually going to be a scion of the next dynasty that's going to take over Egypt after Khufu's sons, or at least he's an ancestor of that dynasty. And so the king is sad and dejected about that, but the chief lector, or the magician, he consoles the king, saying, well, it's not so bad, because first your son is going to rule, and then your grandson, but the third after you, I think, maybe the fourth, will be one of the sons of this woman who is giving birth at this time, or who is about to give birth. And so, let's see, what happens after that? So then the king is okay with that. I mean, he's not happy that his sons aren't going to rule forever, but it's not like he's going to be overthrown anytime soon, so he's mollified, or he's appeased. And so our story then leaves Khufu's court and goes to the home of this woman, Rededet, who is in travail. And so somehow it becomes known, or it's known in her area, or somehow the secret comes out to her servants that her children are destined to be the founders of the next dynasty of kings. And so one of her servants is so disloyal. Of course, one's servants or household slaves are always dreaded in ancient cultures as being possible informers. And so one of these disloyal maidservants, she wants to go and tell the king that it's her, in fact, it's her mistress who is having these children who are going to take over Egypt and end his dynasty. And so something happens somehow. There's some kind of supernatural intervention, of course, but the maidservant is killed, is prevented from delivering the information. At least I think we can assume that. The papyrus actually breaks off before we get to that point, I think. No, okay, no, not quite. Okay, so the maidservant is eaten by a crocodile, it says. The maidservant ran to get herself a drink of water, and a crocodile caught her. And this is after she's been given a beating and driven from the house by the woman who's going to be the mother of the next dynasty. So that's where our papyrus breaks off. So that's the tale of King Khufu and the magicians, or Cheops and the magicians. And so partly it's about these feats of magic and tales of the kings of bygone days, of a more innocent, happy time in Egyptian history. And partly it's sort of about the rise of a new dynasty, and how there's always a new line of kings waiting in the wings, or that change is about to happen, etc. So that's Khufu and the magicians. Now another one that we can talk about here just a little bit is the tale of the Eloquent Peasant. And I'm going to be using this in the 6th installment in our series of 10 studies, which is called The Pot Will Be Shattered, I think is what I'm calling it. Or The Pot Will Be Smashed, that's what I'm calling it. So I was actually going to read the whole thing in its entirety for that study, or present it in its entirety in the written version and in the video version, but it turned out to be too long. But I did make a video version where I just read the whole thing. And as I mentioned in that video, there is an Arabic language film of it made in Egypt in, I believe, 1970 or somewhere thereabouts. And so let anyone who wants to look that up, or view my own reading of it in English. But It is pretty long. The video that I made is like a half-hour long, so. Now, what this story is about, anyway, is a peasant who's eloquent, as you can guess from the title. So, the peasant's name is given as Kunanup, and he lives, I believe, in the Fayum Oasis outside of the Nile Valley, but in any case, he lives somewhere outside of the Nile Valley. And he's a peasant, so you would think it must be an oasis or somewhere where there's arable land, but he is going to take his crops to the market in Egypt, and so in the beginning of the story, he has his wife allocate a certain amount of supplies for him to take on the journey, and he takes his faithful donkey and he's on his way to the market. And as he's coming into the land of Egypt, into the Nile Valley, he's passing through a piece of land that is owned by a guy named Renzi, who is the son of a high steward of the kingdom named Meru. So the land is owned by the son of a high official, and the son, presumably himself, is a high official. And it's being tended, or it's under the supervision of a lower official named Nemtinacht, who himself is rapacious and cruel and acquisitive, and is just the picture of a bad, petty official who tramples on anyone that he can get under his power. And so Nemtinacht sets things up. He spreads some laundry on the path so that the peasant can't pass through without either going into the river or a canal or whatever it is, or going through the fields of barley that are being grown on the land. And so he can't, of course, step on the official's laundry. And so what he does is he walks his donkey through the barley, and his donkey eats a wisp of the barley. And so the official commits a great injustice by demanding the donkey itself as payment for the wisp of barley. So a grossly disproportionate penalty for a trifling offense. Really not an offense at all that one can think of as an offense in a serious way, but and in fact it's all a plot because he was out to get the donkey, and so he put the laundry there so he could force the peasant into this situation. So he beats the peasant for complaining about this whole thing, and the peasant then stays at Nemtinacht's house, or he stays outside of it, sort of camps there and bewails his maltreatment and petitions this guy day after day to no avail. And so finally he decides he's going to go to the high steward's son for justice, because he knows the high steward's son is a just man. And so he goes to speak before the high steward's son, and he turns out to be so eloquent that the high steward's son goes to, I believe he either goes to his father or he goes directly to the king, but he says that this peasant is so eloquent that it's just great to hear him talk, and all these things that he says about justice and how it's important that officials be just towards more vulnerable people, and it's just so wise and salutary, all these things that he's saying, that I just want to keep him talking, really. And so the king says, well, we're not going to give him justice right now, we're going to keep him talking and make him wait. And so they do this, and the peasant makes a series of speeches day after day after day. And sometimes he's more philosophical, sometimes he's more conciliatory, you might say, and sometimes he's fiery and upset and takes the official to task. And his words kind of show that he's coming to the conclusion that the high steward's son is not just, that he's as bad as everybody else, that he's as bad as this lower official who robbed the peasant. And so things go from bad to worse, but you get all of these speeches about the importance of right order and good governance, etc. So eventually the game ends, you could say, and the high steward's son and the king decide, now we'll give the peasant justice. So they take all of his speeches, and I should say this is just when the peasant has given up. So he says, you're not going to help me, so, I give up. I've lost faith in you. So he's walking away, and they call him back. Then they have all of his speeches read out to him when he thinks he's in for a beating or something like that. And then they have them all, I think, inscribed in an official way and as a stela or something, and they're put in a public place. And so the king remarks that, there's no greater wisdom in all of Egypt or something like that. And so then the steward gives the peasant the control over the piece of property where he was outraged. And so the corrupt local official is given as a slave to the peasant, who then gets to enjoy this property or the management of this property after that. And so that's the tale of the Eloquent Peasant, and it's a pretty interesting story about justice and governance and what it's like, or what the lot in life of like is like, of people who are in a weak position in society, and the importance of right order, and that officials do what they're supposed to do, and sort of also about the harsh realities of dealing with people in positions of power, even and especially people in the lower ranks of power who have a sort of chronic desire to maltreat the people under them and get what they can from them, maybe because they feel they themselves are not rich enough or not powerful enough, and they want to get what they can from anyone who's vulnerable to their depredations. And so there's a part that's pretty telling, really, where the corrupt local official says to the peasant who is invoking the high steward's son as his protector, he says, you may be mentioning the high steward's son, but I'm the one who's talking to you, so I'm going to take your donkey, and what are you going to do about it? So now, that's the tale of the Eloquent Peasant. So, another one, I think we'll talk about one more, and then sometime soon I'll make a second video on the Middle Kingdom classics, where we'll talk about the great epic of the Middle Kingdom, which is known as the Tale of Sinuhe or Senuhet. You could think of that as the great epic of Egypt, although, as far as we know, epic poetry, as we know of it, like something like Gilgamesh or the Iliad or the Odyssey or whatever, is not something that was important in Egyptian culture, and so, it's just not something they have a lot of, or that you really find in their literature often, or hardly at all, really. The exception would be this Tale of Sinuhe, so you can think of that as Egypt's great epic, and we'll talk about that next time, because we're already at a half hour here. But this last one is known as the Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, and if I was going to give a whole video to it, I would be tempted to just read the whole thing, because there's not much of it, really, but it's sort of a tale of adventure. You can make of it what you will, because there probably is more of a cultic or mythological aspect to it, or at least, I guess that's possible, although it's not very strongly, doesn't seem to be very strongly suggested here. But I'll take a quick look here and see about the composition of it, and where its provenance, and where it probably comes from. But the papyrus, it says, dates from somewhat later than 2000 BC, it says here. And we have two manuscripts. One is only a little bit later than the other. But the papyrus that we're that we're using here, that our translator used, was discovered, it says, by the preeminent or the eminent Russian Egyptologist Vladimir Golenishev in the Egyptian collection in St. Petersburg, or else it was acquired by him. He published it in 1913, and it is now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. So either this guy acquired it somehow, this Russian guy, or he found it in the collection in Russia, but in, what is that? In what they call the Egyptian collection in St. Petersburg. I guess that would have been the Hermitage or some museum or university in St. Petersburg, but he published it in 1913. And what happens in this is that a sailor, I don't think he gives a name for himself, but he's the narrator of the story. And so he says that he's shipwrecked on an island. I believe it's supposed to be somewhere on the East African coast, because the land of Punt is mentioned, and that is somewhere in the Horn of Africa. But in any case, he is shipwrecked on this island, and he's suddenly confronted by a giant snake, and the giant snake tells him that originally there had been many more of his kind on this island, but for some reason they were destroyed in a fiery conflagration, and now he's the only one left. And so the snake then tells the man that he's going to be rescued and he's going to make it back to Egypt. And so when he's there, when he gets there, the snake wants this guy to tell people about him, or somehow share his story. And so let's see if there's anything towards the very end of this that can give us a little more insight, because it really would take too much time to just read the whole thing. Let's see now. Well, I guess not really, but let's just read the very last few lines here. There's two stanzas, lines 180 to 189. See me after I landed, after I have seen what I experienced. Listen to my words. It is good for men to hearken. Then he, the commander, said to me, Do not be so proper, friend. What is the use of giving water to the fowl at daybreak when it is to be killed in the morning? It has come from beginning to end, as found in the writing of the scribe, skilled with his fingers. Ameni son Amen Ah, may he live, prosper, and be in health. So actually, that's an interesting part, that the captain of the boat that rescues the guy, he is under the impression that he's going to be killed or executed for something he's done wrong, and so maybe I should really try and review this story a little more and find out if there's something important I'm missing here. But there is that ominous note at the end about why waste water on a goose or whatever that you're going to slaughter in the morning. But really it's sort of a fanciful tale about an adventure on a faraway island, and the snake itself the giant snake thing, it doesn't seem to be connected with myth about one of the Egyptian gods or something like that. So it's not really a mythological story, I don't think. So really, you could think of it as more of an adventure story. But before we stop here, before we conclude this, just because we're talking about the New Kingdom, let's show just a few pictures of some artifacts from the New Kingdom. And those are from our go-to book for pictures when it comes to Egypt, the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. So we got some statues of some of the kings of that period. This is a diorite statue there of the young Sen-Usret III from a temple. It says the temple at Medamud. And here is one of 6 granite statues of Sen-Usret III found in the front court of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahri. So that's from the Great New Kingdom burial ground at Deir el-Bahri, where there were all these temples and tombs and everything. But that, of course, is a New Kingdom site, and this is a Middle Kingdom king, so this statue was apparently thought to be worthy of the tomb of a later king. So, let's see. It's actually a pretty well-known statue. I think it's used as illustrations in a lot of books, and I believe it's at the British Museum, and that I saw it at the Field Museum in Chicago in '03 when they had this exhibit called Eternal Egypt, where the great treasures of the British Museum were on tour. They were touring the world, and so they were at the Field Museum that summer, the summer of '03, for a couple of months or a month and a half or so. Now, let's see. Anything else in here? Here's a scene. Here's some figurines from a Middle Kingdom tomb. And you find groups of figurines like this in a lot of tombs from the Middle Kingdom. And what's being shown here is sort of a cattle census being taken, where you can see the scribes squatting down with all their scribal equipment, pens and paper and all that. But they are recording the number of heads of cattle and things like that. So they're deciding how much to tax everybody, the peasantry. So let's see, anything else from the Middle Kingdom? Here's an example of something of the Coffin Texts. I believe this would be an example of what we call the Coffin Texts. And it's from the early to mid 12th dynasty, it says here. 12th dynasty wooden outer coffin of Gua from Deir el-Bersha. And it's decorated with extracts from something called the Book of Two Ways. So there's an example of what the coffin texts would look like on the written inside a coffin. Anything else here? I think that about does it. So we're into the Middle Kingdom classics, and we're well on our way there. We've covered the 3 of the big 4, you could say, and next time we'll do the Tale of Sinuhe. That's the great epic of Egyptian literature, as I said. So there we are, and we're well on our way with this series on Egyptian literature in our series Exploring Ancient Literature once again. So thanks for joining us for this. I hope you're enjoying this, and we'll continue to do so. And we will be back at it pretty soon with our video on the Tale of Sinuhe. So once again, thanks very much, and we'll see you soon.